Welcome to Hidden Betrayal Confessions. Let's get started with today's story. I didn't think much of it at first. I mean, lending money to your best friend isn't exactly unusual, right? He said he just needed a little help getting back on his feet. Short term, no pressure. He'd pay it back. And honestly, I trusted him. We'd known each other for years. But what I didn't expect was how involved my wife became in something that had nothing to do with her. At first, it was small things. She'd ask about him more than usual, check in on whether he'd called me back. Then she started defending him. Not casually, not politely, but almost like she needed me to believe him. That was the first time something felt off. And then he started coming over more often. Sometimes when I was home, sometimes when I wasn't. I told myself it was nothing. But looking back now, that was the moment everything quietly began to shift. Before all of that, things were simple. My wife and I had built a life that felt steady, not perfect but real. We had routines, quiet ones, the kind you don't question because they just work. Mornings were predictable. I'd leave early. She'd usually still be finishing her coffee at the kitchen counter. We didn't always say much, but it was comfortable, familiar. The evenings were the same. Dinner, a bit of TV. Sometimes just sitting in the same room doing our own things. It wasn't exciting, but it felt solid. And my best friend, he had always been part of that life. He'd come by occasionally. Weekends mostly. We'd talk, watch a game, catch up on things that didn't really matter. My wife got along with him well too. Friendly, easy conversations. Nothing that ever stood out. That's why when he asked for money, I didn't hesitate. It wasn't a small amount, but it wasn't something I couldn't handle either. I didn't even tell my wife right away. Not because I was hiding it, just because it didn't feel like a big deal. When she found out, she didn't react the way I expected. She didn't question it, didn't ask why. She just said, "He'll pay you back. He's not like that." At the time, that felt supportive. Looking back, it felt like certainty. And I didn't think about it again. At least, not until he started showing up more often. At first, it felt natural. Then it became consistent, too consistent. Still, nothing was obvious. Nothing you could point at and say, "This is wrong." But something had changed. I just couldn't explain what it was yet. At some point, I stopped noticing when he started coming over more. I only noticed that he was. It wasn't planned, at least not in a way that included me. He'd just show up, sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes early evening, and more than once. I came home and realized he had already been there. My wife would mention it casually. "Oh, he stopped by earlier?" Like it was nothing, and maybe it wasn't. But then I started noticing something else. She always seemed prepared. Coffee already made, snacks out on the table like she knew he was coming before he arrived. I asked her about it once, just lightly. She shrugged and said, "He texted. I told you." Maybe she did. I don't remember. What I do remember is that she never used to check her phone that often before. Now, it was always within reach. Face down more than usual, well, not hidden, just placed in a way that made it hard to see. And then there were the calls. At first, I didn't even pay attention to who was calling. Just the fact that she would step away to take it. Short calls, quiet voice, nothing dramatic. But they happened, regularly. One evening, I happened to glance at her screen when it lit up. His name. That caught my attention. Not because it was wrong, but because it felt unnecessary. If he needed something, why not just call me? I didn't say anything. I just watched. And once you start paying attention, you begin to notice patterns you didn't see before. The timing of the calls, the way her tone shifted slightly when she spoke to him, the way she would end the conversation the moment I walked into the room. Still, nothing concrete, nothing I could confront. Just small things. But small things have a way of adding up. And at that point, I couldn't ignore them anymore. I didn't jump to conclusions. That's not how I think. If something feels off, I don't react. I observe. At first, I told myself there were reasonable explanations. He needed help. Maybe he felt more comfortable talking to her about certain things. But the more I paid attention, the harder that became to believe. The calls weren't random. They had a pattern. Late afternoon, usually around the same time. Short, controlled, almost rehearsed. And it wasn't just the calls. It was how she responded to them. She didn't smile. Didn't seem casual. If anything, she seemed focused, like she was processing something, not just chatting. That was the first thing that didn't sit right with me. The second was how quickly she defended him. And any time I mentioned the loan, even casually, she would step in before I even finished the sentence. He'll handle it. You're overthinking it. He just needs time. It wasn't what she said. It was how fast she said it, like she was already expecting the question. That was the moment I started connecting things. The visits, the calls, the certainty in her voice. Individually. None of it meant much. Together. It started to form something. I remember one night in particular. He had just left. Nothing unusual. Same routine. We talked for a bit. Watched something on TV. Then, maybe 2 minutes after the door closed, her phone lit up. I wasn't trying to look, but I saw the name. It was him. Again. That didn't make sense. Why would he call? Right after leaving. I didn't say anything. I just sat there. Nice, and for the first time, I stopped asking if something was wrong and started asking, what exactly was I not seeing? I didn't bring it up right away. I wanted to be sure I wasn't reading into things that weren't there. That happens more often than people admit. But after a while, it stopped feeling like coincidence. So one evening, I asked. Nothing aggressive, no accusations. We were sitting in the living room. Quiet. The kind of moment where a simple question doesn't feel out of place. I said, "Hey, does he usually call you after he leaves?" She looked at me for a second. Not surprised, just calculating. Then she shrugged. Sometimes, if he forgets something. That made sense, at least on the surface. But I didn't let it go. I asked, "Why not just call me?" That's when her tone shifted, not dramatically, just enough. "You're making it sound weird," she said. "He's your friend. I'm just helping." Helping. That word stayed with me. I nodded. I didn't say it was weird. I'm just asking. She leaned back slightly, crossed her arms. "You've been acting different lately," she added. "Like you're looking for something." That was interesting, because I hadn't said much at all. I kept my voice calm. "I'm not looking for anything. I just noticed a few things." She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "He's stressed about the money, about everything. If he feels more comfortable talking to me sometimes, I don't see the problem." There it was again, not just explaining, but defending. Before I could even question further, I let a few seconds pass. Then I said, "I just didn't realize you two talked that much." Another pause, shorter this time. "It's not like that," she replied. Simple sentence. But it didn't answer anything. And I think she knew that. We didn't argue. No raised voices. No tension you could point at. But something had shifted. The conversation didn't resolve anything. If anything, it made things clearer in a different way. She wasn't confused by my question. She was prepared for it. And that told me something I hadn't fully accepted yet. Whatever was going on, it wasn't new. After that conversation, I stopped asking questions. Not because I felt reassured, but because I realized I wouldn't get anything new from asking. So I did the opposite. I started watching. Not in an obvious way. Nothing dramatic, just paying attention. The kind of attention you give when something doesn't add up, but you're not ready to say it out loud yet. I noticed how often his visits lined up with my schedule. Days I worked late, errands that kept me out longer than usual. He didn't come randomly. He came when I wasn't there. And the calls, they followed a rhythm, almost like checkpoints. A call before he showed up. Sometimes another one after he left. Short, efficient. Not the kind of calls people make just to talk. That was the moment I stopped thinking of it as casual. Because casual doesn't follow a pattern. I also started noticing how she handled her phone. Not hiding it. Just controlling it. Always within reach. Screen angled slightly away. And when it lit up, she would glance first before reacting. Like she needed to know who it was before deciding how to act. One evening, I tested something. I came home earlier than usual. Didn't tell her. The house was quiet, but there were 2 coffee cups on the table, still warm. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. At that point, I wasn't trying to catch them doing something wrong. I was trying to understand what they were doing at all. Because whatever it was structured. And people don't build structure unless there's a reason. The first real answer didn't come from a conversation. It came from something much simpler. A bank notification. At first, I almost ignored it. Just another transaction alert. But the amount caught my attention. It was tied to the money I had lent him. Only, it wasn't going where I expected. I checked the details again. Then again. Same result. Part of that money had been moved. Not back to me, but to an account I didn't recognize. That didn't make sense. So I did something I hadn't done before. I went back through the earlier transactions. Slowly, carefully, looking for anything that didn't fit. And that's when I saw it. Small transfers, not large enough to stand out, but consistent and spaced in a way that felt intentional. The account receiving them wasn't his primary account. It was separate, hidden in plain sight. At that point, I still didn't know what it meant. But I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just about borrowing money anymore. There was a system behind it. And whatever that system was, I was only seeing the surface. At that point, I could have confronted him, or her. But I didn't, because something about it still didn't fit. The money was moving, but not in a way that benefited him directly. At least, not in any obvious way. So I kept looking. Not at the transactions this time, but at the timing. When the transfers happened, what happened around them. And that's when things started to line up, almost too cleanly. Every time a transfer went through, there was a call. Not always long, not always obvious, but always there, between them. That was the first connection. The second took a little longer. I noticed that some of the transfers were linked to decisions I had made, things I thought were separate. A delayed payment here, a shift in how I managed a certain account. even a small change in how I handled one of my assets. At the time, those decisions felt like mine. Looking back, they weren't entirely, because every time I made one of those choices, she had been part of the conversation. Subtle suggestions, questions that seemed harmless. Are you sure you want to move it there? Betrayal, wouldn't it be easier if you did it this way? At the time, it felt like input, support. Now, it felt like guidance, directed. That was when everything changed, because it meant this didn't start with the loan. The loan was just the opening, a reason to create movement, to introduce a new variable into something that had been stable. And once that happened, they didn't need access. They just needed influence. That realization stayed with me, not because it was shocking, but because it explained everything else. The calls, the timing, the certainty in her voice. They weren't reacting. They were coordinating. And I had been part of it the entire time, without realizing I was being led. I didn't react right away, and there was no moment where everything just collapsed. It was quieter than that, more like something settling into place. Because once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Every small detail started making sense, not in isolation, but as part of something larger. And strangely, that clarity didn't make me angry. Not immediately. It made me still. I remember sitting alone one night, just going over everything again. The loan, the visits, the calls, the way she spoke, like she already knew the outcome of things I hadn't decided yet. I trusted her, because I never thought I had a reason not to. And maybe that was the problem, not trust itself, but how easily it can be redirected. I kept asking myself one question, not why they did it, but how long it had been happening. Because if this was planned, then there had to be a beginning, and then I couldn't find it. That was the part that stayed with me, not the actions, not even the coordination, but the realization that I had been adjusting my own decisions based on something I thought was support, when it wasn't. And for the first time, I stopped seeing the situation as something emotional and started seeing it for what it was: deliberate, carefully built, and already in motion long before I noticed anything was wrong. I didn't confront them, not because I was unsure, but because I already knew enough. And more importantly, I understood how they were operating. They weren't forcing anything. They were influencing, quietly. So I did the same thing. I made a few changes. Nothing drastic. Nothing that would raise questions. Just small adjustments. I slowed down certain decisions. Moved a few things back under my direct control. Stopped discussing anything related to money. Completely. At first, nothing happened. Then, the pattern shifted. The calls became less frequent. The visits, less predictable. Not gone, just uncertain. That told me everything I needed to know. Because when the structure started breaking, so did their coordination. I didn't accuse her. I didn't bring up the transactions. We continued as normal, at least on the surface. But something had changed, not in a way you could see, but in how I processed everything. I stopped relying on her input, stopped sharing things that mattered, and over time, the dynamic between us became quieter, more distant, not hostile, just disconnected. As for him, he stopped coming around as often. No explanation. No conversation about the money. Just distance. And I let that happen. Because by then, I wasn't interested in closure. I was interested in control, not over them, over my own decisions. And once I had that back, the rest didn't feel as important anymore. Looking back now, I don't think it was ever about the money. That was just the entry point. Something simple enough to justify everything that came after. What mattered more was how easily influence can replace trust, not all at once, but gradually, in ways that feel helpful at the time, reasonable, supportive. I used to think betrayal had to be obvious, something you could point to, a clear moment where everything changes. But that's not always how it works. Sometimes it builds quietly, through conversations that seem harmless, through decisions that don't feel important, until one day, you realize those decisions weren't entirely yours. That was the part that stayed with me, not what they did, but how it happened without resistance. I trusted her because I believed we were aligned. And maybe at some point, we were. But alignment can shift. And if you're not paying attention, you don't notice until it's already moved. I don't know when it started, and honestly, I don't think that matters anymore. What matters is understanding this. Sometimes the truth isn't hidden. It's just presented in a way that feels familiar enough that you don't question it until you have to.